Thank you for joining us for another episode of Channel Revelations. I'm Ethan Fox, and I'm here with Micheila Sheldan, and we'll be spending the next couple of hours talking to the guides about a number of different questions. And as I always say, I don't discuss these questions or the topics with Micheila ahead of time, just because I don't want her conscious mind to interfere with the information in any way. Of course, she is a trance channel, so we'll be speaking directly to the guides, and her mind doesn't interfere with it. But just to be sure, I take those extra steps. So let's jump right in and bring the guides in.
Right.
So whoever wants to come through, and then we'll go from there.
We have a gathering of many. We are working with the Council of Light. We have the Orion Council. And we also have an assembly of ascended masters.
Anywhere in there, is there, so when you say an assembly of ascended masters, does that include like the Great White Brotherhood, for example, or are they part of that?
They are, yes.
Okay. So what's the difference between when the Great White Brotherhood announces themselves, like in the last show we did, versus when they announce themselves as Ascended Masters?
It's a slight difference in frequency. So keep in mind, of course, when you are speaking with higher guides or guidance, as we'll call it, there are always going to be adjustments. There are modifications made for the information that's necessary to flow, which is not just intellectual in nature. There are certain vibrations that are also a part of each of these ascended masters' energy field. Sometimes they will exclusively name themselves as a collective for the purpose of sharing those codes and genetic lineages with you, for those who might be attending these transmissions to awaken to aspects of their own genetic lineage or relationship, in other words, with many of these guides.
So I'd like to speak with the Great White Brotherhood, or at least reference them, and also the Ascended Masters and the Orion Council, primarily in this first part of the conversation. Madame Blavatsky spoke about having met a group of enlightened masters who she referred to as the Mahatmas. And the Mahatmas also were known as the Great White Brotherhood. So now she said she physically met these individuals somewhere in the Tibetan area, Tibetan Indian area, and they taught her a lot of things, took her on as an initiate, and gave her a lot of wisdom. Is this the same Great White Brotherhood that's physically incarnated that we're talking to?
It's important to understand in situations like this, where there are encounters or channeled transmissions coming through, in other words, there are always deviations from the individual character of a soul that has walked the earth but now exists in a form of light. Meaning, when you are speaking with one or a group of us, it is not just who we were and what we learned on the planet that is a part of that exchange. We're tapping into the entirety of the Akashic records of all aspects of self that we have ever been throughout the cosmos. So the title master, for example, is reconciling this idea. For a master is an aspect of many parts of itself, choosing to walk in an enlightened type of incarnation. But yes, we could say in encounters with us, similar to what you are speaking of, the souls who you have named were certainly present in a form of light, but not necessarily exclusive of any other parts of themselves necessary to support those endeavors.
So are you saying that, so these physical beings that Blavatsky referred to as the Mahatmas or the Great White Brotherhood, they did exist in a physical form, but who we're speaking to as the Great White Brotherhood right now that's one aspect of their incarnation, is what you're saying, that the consciousness we're referring to now in this conversation is more all-encompassing. It includes previous and future lifetimes also, that some aspect of which this physical Great White Brotherhood might have existed on Earth.
That is correct. And also take into account that any soul who transitions from a physical incarnation, while it leaves the earth, continues on as that identity in another state of being. So the lifetime that you believe begins and ends with your birth and death is actually a continuation of many other lifetimes, and this lifetime will also continue to go on. So more evolution does take place, but certainly we agree that those that are known as the Great White Brotherhood now are a form of merged soul vibrations speaking as a one voice, using all of the energy, wisdom, and knowledge that they have assimilated both on the earth and throughout space and time to support humanity.
Okay, so does that Great White Brotherhood in physical form still exist in Tibet or in that region, or are they have they? Well, I know what you're saying. Their incarnation has continued, or rather, that experience has continued on. But if we were to go there today, would we still be able to interact with them?
Not in a physical form exclusively, no.
Okay, so interaction with them now would be like we're having a conversation right now.
Correct.
Okay.
Or perhaps in a time traveled event, a more astral scenario where you are meeting through a merged state with another, similar to ourselves, in what we call multidimensional consciousness.
So the Great White Brotherhood, that she did speak with, is part of the consciousness I'm speaking with now. So they would be able to reference experiences that they had back then as well.
Yes, correct.
Okay. Supposedly, they wrote a group of letters, which I believe were called Letters from the Mahatmas, that were transcribed and that still exists today. Were those documents that the Great White Brotherhood actually wrote that contains wisdom for us?
Yes, and we also want to clarify these letters are channeled accounts or transmissions that are not just coming through one individual. So these are more of a vibrational offering, even though they are in a physical and written form.
So the Great White Brotherhood didn't physically write them down, is what you're meaning, or?
We are meaning to say that they were physically transcribed, however, carried a certain vibrational quality to them.
Blavatsky mentioned that she believed that the Great White Brotherhood was part of an advanced race of beings who lived in that Tibetan or Indian Mount Kailash area, where there was an entryway to an underground city or location where very advanced beings lived that supposedly were people who fled from Atlantis, and that they live in this place called Shambhala, which is their capital city. Is that true?
It is true. However, the more linear translation of this is something that we also prefer to qualify because the inner earth is such a mystical place. It is not something that is as material and tangible as what you experience on the surface of the earth, even in these days. So when you're speaking of Atlantean and an Atlantean lineage, we agree. Many of the beings who came from Atlantis had not only gone through such a pivotal change in their structure due to all of the, we'll say, breakdown or dismantling of the various technologies that held them in such a pure and aligned state, but they also had to reconfigure themselves somewhat to become oriented to a new way of living. And when we speak of the inner earth or underground cities, these are interdimensional in nature. So even today, for example, many ponder the inner earth beings and cities and locations, and there are certainly many. But But the beings that exist in these areas are able to take on a different form. We would call it perhaps even a more vibrationally sound and balanced type of experience that is necessary to allow them to shapeshift and to move between these various locations. So yes, we're agreeing with what you are saying. However, we want to clarify exactly what that experience would have been like, which is very different from what many of you live today.
So is now she referenced that there were Buddhist monks at the time who were protecting an entryway in Nepal or in Tibet rather to this inner earth area or this inner earth city where enlightened beings lived. And but there is some speculation as to whether or not she channeled the information, because there are some myths or stories that have been shared over the years saying that, and even some individuals who supposedly traveled there to the Mount Kailash area and so on to try to find this inner earth entry point. And some of them vanished for periods of time and reappeared and had all kinds of mystical experiences and so on. But there is some question as to whether or not this is a physical entry point that exists and that still exists today, or if it's another dimension that that requires a shift in consciousness, and this information is simply channeled rather than physically visited. Can you share some light on that?
We can. You've asked several different questions here, and we want to start by saying that this area is considered a portal, meaning it's a very sensitive entryway or gate into the inner earth, but also a place in which all dimensions exist. So it would not be unusual for someone of an enlightened consciousness or with an intention to want to visit these areas to find themselves lost of time or to be experiencing things that are very otherworldly, because the energies that have collided, we'll say here in this place, they still remain today very much undisturbed of their original potency and nature. But portals and gates, they are very mysterious things. So we want to speak to the clarification of the Buddhists guarding the gate, because ultimately what we experience even today is that gatekeepers are more interdimensional in nature. Portals are a consciousness. So any portal that exists today, while it may have a physical portal keeper or guard, is actually like a technology guarding itself. Imagine on your planet today the various AI and scanning technologies that many of you might even be concerned about coming to full fruition. In ancient times and in portal locations like this, the elements are doing that work. They're not scanning for ill intent necessarily. They're scanning for a vibrational match and a heart-centeredness to be able to interact in the space in a highly conscious way. Because these inner earth communities, very much like Atlantis, were holding a specific frequency. And oftentimes that frequency in and of itself would make dramatic changes to those who entered who were not used to it. But because these civilizations were so tight-knit and there were many different beings living together in harmony, someone who came in without the correct alignment or intention of heart-centeredness could disrupt the entire structure. So we're looking at very subtle and delicate balances of energy that were attempting to be upheld. Now, when you speak of Blavatsky, we aren't necessarily seeing her having deliberate physical interactions in this place. There was a great deal of time travel and moving between dimensions in a remote viewing type of scenario. And we want to also explain that sometimes remote viewing, if it's not done from a very pure state, it can alter your response, or the response itself can be led by another. So we're not necessarily wanting to place ill intent here, but also say that a great deal of the translation of that could be coming more from mind as opposed to the true vibrational analogy of what was observed. Because even though we agree that many of the physical beings, the Buddhists, for example, that may have been in that location around the time that this area was very well known, may have been protective of it. They weren't necessarily assigned nor capable of protecting it in the way this technology we speak of could have. And we want to also relay here, without getting too far off track of what you are asking us, the idea of dragons, because dragon energy is seen very much in the renderings of these ancient civilizations. And dragons were not necessarily a replica of the physical manifestation of these beings. Dragons were elemental beings that existed within the earth with the purpose of guarding very sensitive entryways, portals, and points that could be construed as valuable by those who did not have either humanity's interest in mind or the beings who were present in the inner earth in mind. So there are many different considerations in terms of the translation of what exactly happened here. But it's very similar for those who are familiar with Mount Shasta today. The Telos, for example, are a group of beings who we see very interconnected with that Atlantean Lemurian lineage, living within a multidimensional location beneath the earth, and using these dragon gates to enter and travel between various locations.
Okay, I want to clear up a few points just simply so I understand. First of all, it was said that in order to enter Shambhala, and first of all, before I get to that, it was said that Agartha was this enlightened city, and Shambhala was the capital of the city. Is that correct?
We wouldn't name it necessarily as such, but yes, we certainly believe those locations existed and are correct.
And it was also believed that in order to gain access to Agartha or Shambhala, one had to be of a pure heart. Is that what you're referring to with the dragon gates? It was not something that physically could be entered, but you had to be of a certain vibration.
Correct. And let's go a bit deeper into this just for the sake of interest, because the idea of a pure heart is something that could be very vague or defined in different ways. When we're speaking of purity of the heart, what was observed in these times was whether or not a soul was existing in a state of unity consciousness, meaning it was not putting itself above or beyond the rest of its civilization. And in entering this area, had some very important purpose to share that was going to uplift or somehow support not only those who existed there, but have a ripple effect, in other words, to the surface of the earth, which we think this is important to remember. Those underground locations, multidimensional cities, they exist beneath the earth because it is such a rich and nourishing environment with connections that are wired throughout the entire surface. So if something is happening in the way of expansion, in other words, is going to have more of a dramatic effect on those that exist beyond that city, that are more physical in nature. But the opposite could happen as well. Imagine that the elements in these areas, even the waters, for example, were so potent that if something had gone awry, very easily there could be mass destruction, not only in the areas in which these portals existed, but well beyond, because portals are a collective in and of themselves. They are connected in a matrix. So this was the purpose, was seeing if there was not necessarily a loss of ego, but a relationship to the self that had been cultivated as a mirror reflection of many others. And that was the important criteria, we'll say, that allowed passage.
I believe, from what you're saying and from what I know that was written about Blavatsky, she said she met with the Mahatmas, and it sounds to me like she physically met with them, so they must have been some sort of human beings who maybe had interaction with the Agartha or beings that were from that place. But what you're saying is that she didn't actually physically go to Shambhala. She was channeling that information, and because of the tendency to interpret that information, it might not have come through in its purest form. Am I understanding correctly?
We agree with that determination. Yeah.
Okay. So the spiritual tradition or the theosophical school that she started, which was based on those teachings, might not be entirely correct then.
When you say correct, we're not exactly sure what you're referring to, because
Are the teachings authentic to what the Great White Brotherhood and what they would be teaching in Shambhala?
not exactly.
Okay. Now, so based on what you're saying about what it means to have a pure heart, one of the things that also happened in the early to mid 1900s was that Hitler and the Nazi Party were very interested in Agartha, and they believed that they knew where the entry point of Agartha was, and he believed that Agartha and Shambhala were the descendants of Atlantis or the Aryan race, which he believed himself and his party or his group of people to be descendants of. But what you're saying is that he also couldn't have had any interaction with them because of the purity of heart. Am I understanding correctly?
Well, keep in mind that sometimes these various rulers, similar to Hitler that you are speaking of, they were using oracles and channels themselves to bypass the, we'll say, determination of a pure heart, meaning there was a median or a distortion put in the way such that the original intent of the being or the information that was needed was somewhat skewed from its reality.
When you say channels that were used, are you referring to the Thule Society? As I think he had some interaction with them. Is that where this came from?
That would be a perfect example, yes. There were many that were gathered for the purpose of exploring these various areas, as well as the information and knowledge that could be tapped into and utilized in these spaces.
So just to understand an individual like that, the interest in occult and metaphysical teachings of what appears to be a more enlightened race, what's the mechanism that would allow? So he really didn't have access to that information, from what I'm understanding, based on what you're saying, because he was not pure of heart. Or was he an enlightened being just choosing to live a very dark life in our interpretation?
He was not directly accessing the information through and of himself. This is the consideration that we think is of note, because even though we could say that at the very core of this being, there is a lineage of love and appreciation for humanity. The direction and the choices that this soul went were quite opposite of that expression. And that is why the assembly of so many enlightened others around him was necessary. And it's also our opinion that those who were charged with channeling this information or time traveling to receive it were not given all of the information as to how or why it was yet how it was yet to be used or why it was going to be used. In fact, they may not even have known that the man that they were retrieving it for was of ill intent at all. So there were a great many stories, we'll say, that were cultivated around this group of oracles to somewhat keep them in the dark as to the journeys that they were taking and the reasons for them. And we know your question might be, if they were such advanced beings themselves, why would they not have felt the disillusionment of the one who was sending them on the journey? But not every channel or oracle is actually focused on the highest and best result for the whole of humanity. Even though they believe in their hearts that they are, they may be focused in ego or on the self or on financial gain. For example, these things were still happening long ago. So even though these dragon gates, we'll call them, were very conscious and very advanced in terms of ensuring the purity of heart, there were some very adept at energy and the quantum field that had the ability to override them. Now, a man like Hitler, for example, while understanding the mechanics of energy and channeling, was not truly enlightened enough himself to be able to do that. And that's why there was a great reliance on many of these assistants, we'll call them. But what we want to explain is this group that was working on behalf of Hitler. They were able to form somewhat of a bypass or a bridge, we will call it. Not that they bypassed the technology of scanning for pure heart, but were able to tap in differently to the Akashic records without directly going in as a being that had shape-shifted or somehow transformed. This can be done today, as a matter of fact. Enlightened souls who have the ability can tap into the energy field of another and understand what they are thinking and what they are feeling, and can go back into their Akashic records and retrieve information to better understand them at an intrinsic level. So much of this was going on at the time.
So if it's necessary to have a pure heart to enter Shambhala, and let's suppose somebody had a pure heart in whatever that you described that was, would they be able to, in some physical form, enter Shambhala, or would it be purely in an altered state of some sort?
There would have to be a slight alteration of form in order to coexist with the beings who lived in that place or continue on there, in other words. Because if it is purely multidimensional and a human soul is existing more in a third dimensional or material reality, there could truly be no ability to interface directly. Not to say that in today's world, physical beings aren't having direct interface with intergalactic ones. But remember, this was a protected area, a very sensitive area of the earth, a portal in and of itself. So what we notice is in passing through, a physical being may have had to slightly adjust its vibration into a higher state, and in so doing, may become less materially focused or conscious and in a state of coherence. It's somewhat like today visitation on intergalactic ships where human souls are taken or visit these various different forms of technology. Even though it may feel extremely physical, and there can be sensations of sight and touch and sound, any human soul that visits for a period of time a ship technology has become changed in order to do that, ever so slightly. And that's why coming back from the experience is often the catalyst for such remarkable changes in the life of a soul. This can be an intense period of awakening, for example, or it can be a period in which we're reviewing our past transgressions and heartache. That slight shift in vibration is going to cause our physical reality to change and to somehow recalibrate to meet the experience that we have just had.
Is this transformation in any way similar to awakening experiences that people have, or is it different somehow?
It is somewhat like a meditative experience, but a conscious and meditative process where you are in movement. If you have ever experienced a conscious state of awakening, it is often like moving through the physical plane in heightened awareness or even in a state of bliss, where you might even forget the physical body exists at all because you are so focused on the details of what you are viewing and the experiences that you are having that a part of you that is dense is no longer existent in your mind. But that part of you nonetheless has come with you. It's just somehow reassembling. This happens today as well in other portals. So if there is a time loss that happens, an event where someone visits a portal or even in their own home are jumping timelines and have lost a number of hours or even just a few minutes, this is a hyper aware and conscious state of coherence where all dimensions are accessed simultaneously, or a soul is walking into a more multidimensional location and experience beyond what they were before. It takes some shifts, both at the level of the physical material as well as the electromagnetic field that surrounds that material. But you were meant to do this. You were built to do this. In other words, it's just that many of you have forgotten how to do it. It's somewhat like an automatic transition. For example, today humans may be existing in a very stark experience of fear, and in a moment's notice, their body will change drastically because hormones fluctuate and the physical body becomes stronger and the mind will become crystal clear to support that soul to move through that period of physical challenge. It's very much similar, we believe, when a soul is entering an inner earth location, a multidimensional reality, or a ship or a portal. It isn't often recognizable, yet it happens nonetheless, where you become a bit less physical and a bit more oriented to light.
Do Agartha and Telos still exist in our current linear timeline, or are they existing in a different timeline or dimensional reality?
Each are a bit different. So we'll start with Agartha, and both do still exist. However, we wouldn't necessarily put them directly on your timeline. So Agartha is such an ancient underground city that it's evolved at a very accelerated pace. Think about the evolution of the inner Earth in terms of the Earth's grid system, for example, the Earth's poles, the channels of energy that run from the galactic core, and all of the electromagnetic energy that is pulsating within her. That is going to have a very dramatic effect on the beings and the locations deep within Earth. So what we've noticed about Agartha is it is more a ninth to 11th dimensional reality, meaning that even though it's a part of your physical Earth, it isn't tangibly recognizable by many of you. In fact, most of you, because in order to perceive it and to actually visit it tangibly, the mass of humanity would have to exist in that same dimension, meaning you would be holding a ninth to 11th dimension quite consistently in order for you to have more physical experiences of the city or location, we'll call it, in your physical timeline. Telos is a portal, and of course, because of that, it has access to all dimensions, but because it's somewhat more of a blend of surface and inner Earth location, it hasn't evolved so radically in its dimensional, we'll say, preclusion. Even though a location can be multidimensional, it also holds a dominant frequency. So we want to give you an example because we know that those who are gathering around these transmissions are focused on the fifth dimension. And we see the fifth dimension as an access way or a passageway to the multi-dimensions. So it's much easier in a fifth dimensional reality for individual souls to have different multi-dimensional timeline experiences than others. And this is what we see with Telos. It is a multi-dimensional reality, more fifth to seventh in its presentation, but nonetheless having this incredible access to many other locations and dimensions as well.
If we were to go to one of these locations today, and assuming we could gain entry, if we didn't exist in that, let's take in the case of Agartha, in that 11th or 9th to 11th, I think, dimensional space, what would we see? Just cave structures and so on, but we wouldn't see any people or civilization, just an empty space?
Well, you wouldn't be able to actually exist there because from a quantum perspective, the physicality that you exist within is a manifestation of the vibration and the light that you hold. And that is going to be the basis for any experience that you have. So it would be almost impossible for you to visit from a physical sense Agartha in the state that you're in today. It does not mean that individual human souls aren't having multidimensional experiences there. For example, if you are a meditator and you are regularly practicing, you are shifting your vibration on a chronic and constant basis. And there will be some fluctuation throughout your day where you may be resonating higher than the fifth dimension at times, or you may even be resonating lower than the fifth dimension at times. But that's why those who practice remote viewing, for example, or time traveling or telepathy are so focused on the breath. Because to state a clear intention and be vibrating in a very accelerated fashion is to allow you to have an experience of almost anything. So what's happening, and we've brought this to your attention in past transmissions, is that you're using your plasma your human plasma to be able to visit Agartha or to have an experience in Telos, not your actual physical body and physical senses, which is a much different type of experience, but just as valuable. And perhaps we could say it could lead you to interact with the beings who are there, the living beings like even plants or elements or rocks, and have a conversation with them, as well as in a location like Telos. So those of us who speak to you today, we are actually existing in a state of plasma in this moment. And that's how you are receiving the information and energy, because this channel is in a vibratory state where the plasmic access is at its peak. And every human has that peak plasmic access that they can work with and even tend to expand. But some actually come in, meaning they come to Earth with a very plasmic field. And it is simply a indication of many lifetimes where they've developed a relationship to that plasma, or they may in fact be somewhat hybrid in a sense, tending to operate more in their crystalline energy or light vibration than physical. But plasma is everything. Plasma is key. So we might say it'll take a much longer time for humanity to get to the point where they could physically visit a location like Agartha. But today, it's possible for those who are dedicated and practice to use their plasma to visit there in a very altered and sensory way.
What is the significance of mountains? It seems like in the case of Agartha, it's located near Mount Kailash, and of course Telos is Mount Shasta. Is there any connection there?
Think of the landform, not necessarily characteristic of a mountain, because for a mountain to form, there's been alchemy that has taken place. The very precious elements and soils and rocks have combined in such a way that there's a protective area and an entry point around a very sensitive ley line or energy meridian within Earth. And we see this happening all the time. It's not to say that every mountain on planet Earth is a portal or is an entryway to the inner Earth, but many of them are, simply because the combination of the vibratory materials that has formed it is easy access, we'll say, for those who exist in a state of light to enter. Or beneath the earth, there's a culmination of that vibration, making it easier for those who've lived on the earth to now integrate themselves into a state where they are more comfortable in an environment beneath it. Actually, this is why in Shambhala, the Atlanteans were so present. Remember, this was a period of cataclysm, and there were a great many shifts taking place on planet Earth. Land masses had completely collapsed, and new ones were coming into formation. And these mountains or these land masses, they were a very obvious sign to those who had migrated from these communities that potent elemental earthly energies were resonant with their way of living. Remember, in Atlantis, the technologies that were created to raise vibration and to hold a specific level of quantum coherence were elemental in nature. They were fused together using water, air, earth, ether, crystal, such that everyone was feeling resilient and energetic and unified and somewhat purposeful in their endeavors. So imagine not having that anymore. but viewing a technology that nonetheless came together magically and perfectly just for them. This is how many in these ancient times would have seen these landforms.
Now, it's believed in India that Shiva lived in Mount Kailash with his family. Now, was that true?
We certainly see Shiva living in this location because of the potent energies that were present, but you also must keep in mind that Shiva was a hybrid and an intergalactic being having the ability to travel well beyond the earth as well.
It was also believed that Mount Kailash was originally a pyramid that he constructed and that he lived inside of, and that it's just simply worn away so much through thousands of years of weathering to now where it doesn't look quite pyramid-like, but more like a mountain. Was that the case?
Well, not necessarily, because hybrids who were creating pyramids were not doing so in a sense of physical construction only. What you must keep in mind is that in working with the earth, there were often intergalactic architects who would come in and assimilate the area to a specific request or a need. While pyramids still exist today, and we can go into great detail as to why they were created and what their purpose is, the area that you speak of was more a land mass that had been seen as so valuable that it became a technology in and of itself vibrationally. So someone like Shiva, for example, coming in with the ability to work with energy would have used various light technologies to call to the elementals to change their location and form to certain precision, we'll say, cuts and angles that would preclude the inner resonance, allowing it to come into perfect harmony. So while we could call it a pyramid, what we're attempting to relay here is it may not have looked exactly as you would picture a pyramid from ancient Egypt, for example, but nonetheless no different in its characteristics.
So you said Shiva was a hybrid. What kind of hybrid was he?
A multidimensional one, in fact. We look at Shiva's origins as going back to Sirius, and Sirius was a very popular location for many of the hybrids of the time who came in, but this was not his only cosmic origins. In fact, we see Shiva having a very advanced and lengthy cosmic lineage, in fact, sitting on many of the councils that you have spoken of or spoken to in these transmissions. But coming to Earth, Shiva chose to intermingle many of his different genetic lineages from cosmic locations to take advantage of them in human form. So when a hybrid comes to Earth, it isn't always necessarily that they are choosing one galactic lineage or another, or they've come from one specific star system that they will decide to stake claim to on planet Earth. Sometimes, as a being is coming through that tunnel of light from the state of connection that it is in, it chooses to have access to all aspects of itself, which is why it is seen often as a master, not because it is somehow wiser and more knowledgeable than any other, but because in a moment's notice, it has the ability to tune in and transfer what it has known before into the present moment in a very applicable way. And this is who Shiva was. Also being able to tap into those galactic powers, if you will, from an extrasensory standpoint, which is why he was seen in such physical prowess or strength, in other words, even sometimes as a warrior, because those who came in with these natural abilities in the crystalline DNA, they were able to shapeshift to whatever was necessary on planet Earth at the time that they were facing. And this was a true advantage. It's truly very similar also to who you are and your capabilities that have been suppressed through time.
Was there any significance to, I assume this is the hybridization process that causes them to appear a certain way in this physical dimension? Shiva, as an example, is sometimes depicted in blue, just like Krishna as well. What's that significance of the blue skin? Is there any connection there?
It's not typically the same on every being, but we do want to define the two that you are speaking of because we actually see it very similar in nature. Skin color is often a reflection of not only genetic lineage, but how a soul is working with many hues and spectrums of light within a physical body. For example, on each one of you, at the core of the cell, there is a spectrum of light that is radiant and nutrient. And through that cell spectrum, your physical body appears. And sometimes the skin color is a reflection not only of the physical lineage that you have been born to and have chosen, but also a reflection of the various combination of these color spectrums that so make up your genetics. Now, we see the blue color not necessarily being reminiscent of any one cosmic lineage, but we're looking at the propensity to use light in a very, we'll say, highly plasmic way, again, meaning there was constant turnover and transformation of the physical body through light. And sometimes this was like using prana as the nutrient source, the breath that these beings were working with. It was a far more advanced type of exchange with the atmosphere than what many of you are even drawing within your physical lungs, because their technology was designed completely differently. Remember, we're looking at a being that may have practiced in the rites and teachings of Kundalini and Tantra, and came with such an advanced structure that they were a walking reflection of that in each moment, meaning that the breath that they were bringing in was causing the color of their skin to reflect like a spectrum of light, all of the energy that they were producing. Blue doesn't necessarily mean one thing or another in terms of the color. It's just showing us that a soul is working with more of its plasma.
One of the children of Shiva was Ganesh, supposedly. Now, Ganesh is depicted as more of an elephant type of humanoid being. Was that a different hybridization process that caused him to appear in that physical form, or was that just an illustration? He really didn't appear in an elephant form?
Yeah, we'll answer both questions here. Remember, the children were manifested somewhat like Immaculate Conception. These were tantric types of relationships where a womb was prepared to allow a soul to come through it somewhat like a portal and manifest on earth for a very specific purpose, even in a very highly advanced state of consciousness. And this is how we see Ganesh coming in, not a physical manifestation of birth so much as more an immaculate conception of energy. And this certainly is an example of how a parent choosing a multidimensional expression might mentor a child who is choosing one that is more linear in its reflection. And we actually see Ganesh coming more through a Syrian Lyran type of expression than any other. And the renderings of him, while looking very much like an elephant, are slightly different than he would have appeared. It does not mean he did not have these characteristics necessarily, But remember, he, as an intergalactic soul, was interacting with beings who were more human in their nature. And if you are interacting vibrationally with a hybrid, you're going to slightly change in order to have that interaction. So it is almost like a channeled encounter at times, where much like Blavatsky would have translated the information from Shambhala and told a story, humans who are painting a picture of Ganesh are piecing together that image like a puzzle from a time-traveled event that they have just had. It's not to say that those humans didn't remember the meeting in and of itself or weren't conscious of it necessarily. But if a hybrid is known to shapeshift, if they're using energy completely different than another human is, then there are going to be characteristics about them that are also going to shapeshift and change with the amount of light that they are working with and that they are carrying. And this is a codependent type of relationship as well. We see Ganesh more as a enlightened healer than necessarily a teacher, even though he's been seen in that light. And he was doing a lot of energetic transference in the time that he existed on planet Earth. This was done collectively, it was done individually, and this caused him to take many different forms. So the elephant in this region was a very revered animal, and Ganesh himself was very revered. So the two were seen somewhat in symbiosis.
So let me just reiterate so I can make sure I understand. So what you're saying is Shiva and Ganesh, as an example, were both hybrid beings, and as a result, were they existing on Earth in a slightly different dimension? So the average human being today, for example, would not have been able to perceive them in physical form.
Some were, and others were not in the time that he existed. So Shiva is known as a god because his presence on earth was somehow necessary to be seen, heard, and felt for advancements in consciousness to be made. But that doesn't necessarily mean that every human being interacted with him deliberately. So to answer your question, we would say there were times in which Shiva may have appeared to a slight few or many, and there are times when he existed in a pure state of light, where his energy was accessed only by those in a meditative state.
In a previous conversation, we spoke with Akhenaten and the religion that he professed, or rather taught back then. And the religion was really that God was within ourselves, so know thyself as God, and rather not to worship Akhenaten as a god. And now in India, Shiva and Ganesh and various others are worshipped as gods. Was that a problem? Was that it sounds to me like if Shiva was of the Syrian race, and so was Ganesh, they wouldn't have taught a spiritual or religious belief system where they were seen as gods or worshipped as gods. Am I on the right track?
We understand what you're saying, but we want you to recall that this is a different timeline, different dimension than the one that Akhenaten existed within. And not every teaching that has been left behind of the hybrids that we have been speaking of, like Shiva, is accurate to what those beings would have wanted humanity to know and understand. It's natural for humans to want a god or a savior or one who they can worship that takes away their pain or suffering. And to have the presence of gods like this on planet Earth at the time, it caused what we would say a great divide at times. And this divide is still seen in this region today, where there are some who would have worshipped these gods and others who would have been more focused on a god, a prime creator. Yet Gods known as Shiva, for example, or even Ganesh, they were here in more of a heart-based type of expression, but more even human in their nature, we might say, meaning they were here to explore what it might be like to understand a soul vibration, to live in a soul vibration. It was a two-way type of offering. We think today that hybrids or gods come in and they are here to offer us something, but there is nothing that we are giving them in return. And that could not be further from the truth. Even today, there are many enlightened souls who are walking a purposeful path, who have come in with incredible gifts and abilities, who still take on the understanding of the human condition as a part of their evolutionary journey and karmic path. And these things go hand in hand. So we're not seeing perfection in these beings. That's the point that we want to make. It isn't necessarily ego, though, either. What we're noticing is a propensity of humans to revere those who are different than them, who have certain powers or knowledge, but not necessarily the beings receiving that reverence, wanting it in the way it was given. In many of the traditions that are carried out today, may be focused on giving that power away, and sometimes not. We know that there are some who are focused on a being like Ganesh, for example, in prayer, but feel a strong connection to him as a mentor or a guide or a servant even. And the purpose or the mission of these beings, it still goes on today. So we think a lot has been misconstrued in history, and some of this has been purposeful, of course, to put humans in a position of vulnerability and weakened power, when in fact those who may have been present with them at the day or at the time or the period that they were present would not necessarily have been giving up their power so readily.
In previous conversations, we've discussed a variety of different iconography that exists in the world. For example, the eagle that's used that we discussed was a connection to the ancient Anunnaki, and also the ancient god Garuda, which was a representation of the Anunnaki as well. But we also discuss the lion beings being a representation of the Syrians. And one thing that I find interesting is that both Tibet and India use the lion in their either in their flag or their insignias, and both are regarded very spiritual places and have a very long term, going into the tens of thousands of years, lineage of spirituality and consciousness, and a lot of ancient gods and goddesses who lived in those areas. Is it fair to assume that the lion insignia was used in their iconography as a link or a representation of Sirius?
Yes, it was. And keep in mind, you've been asking us a great deal about the inner earth beings related to the Atlanteans and the elder Atlanteans, some of those who originally came to form and create that civilization, manifested from Sirius. So that lineage, it's perpetuated on, and it's shown in much of the iconography, as you speak of, in dedication to those beings. But even in later periods of time, where the lion has continued in archaeology, for example, there wasn't necessarily a direct link to understanding it being a sign of Sirius. Those were lions were seen as the guardians of gates. And remember, we are speaking of these various extrasensitive areas like portals having their own consciousness and their own technology, sometimes even appearing to humans in a metaphysical sense or an astral sense, like a dragon or a lion.
So, by that, are you saying that individuals or governments who used this iconography didn't do so with the knowledge of the Syrian lineage that they came from. They are just doing it for other reasons.
Not necessarily. We do think there are some in the know, in other words, who understand the power of that lineage and those who came from that civilization, and the fact that they are still existing in the portals and the sensitive areas, able to be communicated with and utilized as wisdom keepers and record keepers.
Would it be reasonable to assume that if a nation such as India or Tibet is using the lion iconography indicating Sirius or the Syrian race, that that particular nation may have a different purpose or consciousness or anything like that than a nation that might use Garuda or the Anunnaki symbolism, such as the United States?
Well, certainly it's reflective of a difference in consciousness. Not to say, of course, that every being in each race is completely the same in terms of their consciousness level. But remember, we are looking at history here. So perhaps what we're peering into is the intentions and perhaps even the origins of some of the leaders of these various civilizations. Even ascended masters who were trained within these areas may have been alarmed or understanding the intentions of those that they would meet as they were taking a pilgrimage of those lands based on these various symbols. So yes, we agree with you that this is showing a slight difference in level of consciousness. But remember, this is attuning to history and not necessarily always reflective of these geographic regions today.
Now, in Indonesia, their flag is actually a depiction of Garuda holding a ribbon in its claws, and it looks very similar to the United States seal. But of course, the United States, there is no connection made to Garuda, and in Indonesia, they actually have a Garuda Airlines too. So it's clearly they are fully aware of the use of this god, who was a very violent and aggressive god in ancient depictions of him. Whereas the US are using the eagle, but it's almost exactly a duplicate of the same iconography. Now, in previous conversations, we talked about Garuda being Anunnaki. Is it representing a particular being, Anunnaki being, or just the whole collective together?
Not in every circumstance. So certainly we do see in some circumstances that Garuda is honored as a god or an enlightened being, but more so, it's harnessing the power of that god or the energy of that being. That's what we most want to express in the translation of these various choices, because remember, you're looking at a group of human beings in an upper echelon experience of others, attempting to replicate some of the ceremonies that were had very early on in their civilizations, where power was exchanged hands, not in a deliberate and known fashion, but by taking it from others. So some of these symbols are a replication of the very acts and history that they stand for. Yet, remember, there are so many who are even unaware of this. So even while a government agency may choose or a certain geographic region may affiliate with a symbol like this, it does not mean that everyone who is associated with it, especially in a governmental way, makes the deliberate connection. But it matters not. So remember, when we're looking at something like iconography or symbology, it holds the history within it in a vibrational sense. So to place it in as many locations as possible, especially in government offices, for example, or to use it in an expression of currency, for example. It's keeping the vibration of that energy alive. And that can be a very positive thing for the humans that are connected to it, or as we have discussed in past transmissions, it can actually lower the vibration or the sense of worth within the collective.
Was Garuda an enlightened being?
When you use the word enlightened, we want to make the distinction between access of energy and knowledge and the use of such. Because in many of the ancient civilizations that we've been speaking of, there was a reverence for accessing the cosmic universe or the Akashic records and being able to manipulate energy or work with it in a very metaphysical sense. So to be able to do that would require you to access a certain level of consciousness or to be seen oftentimes as enlightened, which sometimes depicts a soul being far more advanced in its ability. But just because that advancement or enlightenment is present does not mean that the intention is always good. And so even today on planet Earth, we notice that there are some who are enlightened in terms of that definition, but are using their access to knowledge and power to do things of ill intent. And this we could say about many of those in ancient civilizations, especially someone like Garuda.
So you mentioned that when a nation or a country or a region uses this iconography, that they're able to tap into this the energy or the power of these entities or individuals. So can we make a generalization then that nations such as the United States or Indonesia that use Garuda are tapping into that more warlike, aggressive Anunnaki energy versus India and Tibet, which clearly have a very spiritual lineage by comparison, where the U.S. is known for creating wars all over the world. Can we make that determination that that they're tapping into a more spiritual vibration with the use of the lions versus when they're using the Garuda figure?
Well, we agree with what you're saying, and we think it's quite clear. As you observe these various patterns and these various symbols, you are seeing the reflection of what they stand for.
So simply by a nation choosing those kinds of the different kinds of iconography, they can align themselves with a different, let's say, future or path or experience. So let's say you were to create an entirely new nation and use lions in the iconography. Would you automatically be tapping into that energy to create that reality in that nation's experience?
Well, it would take much more than that, we believe. So the very idea that a nation would adopt a more Syrian reflection in its iconography, we think would go along with a shift in consciousness. So putting something into a physical environment without the exact match of consciousness to be able to interact with it, it doesn't necessarily make as much of a difference as what you might imagine. So simply using a lion iconography is not going to bring in higher consciousness. It would be a tool, we would say, in the toolbox, but also keep in mind that there is a bit of a limitation around using these exclusive symbols at all. And we're not necessarily saying that it's wrong, that a country like India is more associated with a heartfelt type of God than another. But remember, as humans, you've come from a lineage of many different cosmic families. So to even focus on one, we think, as being higher or better than another, it somewhat mimics the conditions of your current reality that are so limiting already. Meaning that to even focus in on one race as being the evolutionary savior over another is limiting your DNA. And what we want for humanity is to be able to tap in and to express that cosmic and multidimensional lineage in whatever way it chooses. And this would bring back, we think, a true sense of sovereignty where humans would become the living manifestation of their own hybrid priority, and that could change. But because of that, we think the illumination of consciousness would follow suit. Meaning, if everyone was stepping into the truth of who they are organically, even in very small ways, without having to focus it on one thing or another, the world could change so rapidly. But unfortunately, there has been so much suppression and so much distortion in the way of expressing your truth that if we got too far into choosing one symbol or another, our fear would be that you would go along on the same trajectory. You see what we're saying?
Mm-hmm. Now, the use of the lion iconography in India and Tibet, and in that region, which is the region that that the Atlanteans settled in that underground area that we discussed earlier, was the use of the lion? Does that go back in time to the Atlanteans moving there? Was that done intentionally, and in a time where people knew why they were doing it, and now it's just simply carried as a tradition into modern times?
Yes, we could certainly say that. And remember, much of what you're seeing is on the surface of the earth, which we think is interesting, considering we've started this conversation with an inner earth civilization. When you begin to see concrete physical manifestations or symbols on the surface of the earth relating to things that exist below it, it's a very good sign because ultimately what you want is the reunion of all aspects of Mother Earth as one. And so this was a period of time where we might say the consciousness was a bit more advanced, and the building of these various structures and architecture with the symbology, it was really just a continuation, in other words, of all of the knowledge that was being exchanged in the inner earth, and even sharing it, we'll say, in a very constructive way with those that existed beyond it.
So if that's the case, what can we say about the United States or America, for example, North and South America, which means land of the plumed serpent, which, of course, we may say is, would you say that that's a representation of Garuda then? And if so, what is happening beneath the earth here that would match that?
So many things, and it's very hard to qualify because remember, these are multidimensional experiences, and the earth has changed so much. But there certainly are many underground cities and gateways and passages beneath the United States. In fact, we think there are so many vibrant and potent areas that can absolutely be tapped into where beings exist. But it does not mean that the symbology that you're seeing on the surface of the earth in the United States is actually a reflection of negative entities or beings beneath the earth. Certainly, we do see the Garuda influence. We definitely see more of a reptilian type of influence as well. But a lot of what's happened in this region, it truly dates back to some of the issues that have gone on beyond, because the settlers that came into these areas, many of them had been influenced by quote unquote gods who had done things, or hybrids, we'll say, who had done things that were not in humanity's best interest. So a lot of the origins of government or we'll say mentorship or councils in the United States are truly coming from more of a malevolent intent. And that doesn't necessarily always reflect what's going on beneath the surface of the earth. Because if we lose touch with Gaia Sophia as humans, meaning energetically and physically, we see ourselves as separate of her, and as individuals, we see ourselves separate of each other. And this is taught and it's reinforced in schooling and our upbringing. We're going to see more separation and division between the inner and the surface of the earth. And naturally that is going to happen, but ultimately what we're going for is to find some sort of reunion and stability where we can tap into these various beings, we'll call them, that are supportive of humanity. And keep in mind also, we've talked a lot about portals today and land masses, and there are many in the United States. But Earth herself, Gaia Sophia as a being, exists as a portal to the universe, meaning that sometimes we notice humans are reaching into the astral and attempting to retrieve information from angels and intergalactic councils, which are all of great help. But the inner earth is what allows human beings to do that. So there is a connection to the core and a connection to the frequency of what you've called the Schumann resonance that holds humans in an altered state, that helps them to ground here as physical beings while also be able to use their cosmic nature in a very wide scope. We think this is one of the most valuable assets of the inner earth locations beneath the United States, which might also be why there are so many who see the United States as valuable, meaning the elements that exist beneath her are so rich and so wonderful and have been used in ancient civilizations to harness energy, that those that exist on the surface want to stake claim to those things. And we think this is one of the themes that you're noticing.
Now, what you said earlier about the surface matching what's happening in the inner earth. So let's take the Tibetan Mount Kailash Indian area as an example, which has depictions of lions as their iconography, which would indicate, as we discussed, assembling a few pieces together, so tell me if I'm on the wrong track. So that lion iconography is suggestive of the Atlanteans having moved there after the Great Flood and the destruction of Atlantis. And so that iconography of the Syrian lions carried through to modern times in their nation's flag and seals and so on. Now, is that match that's occurring on the surface that's also happening in the inner earth the result of interaction that's taking place between physical human beings and the inner earth beings? Or is it just simply a vibrational match that's occurring between the two?
It's both. Now, we can't qualify the number of human beings who have time traveled to the inner earth in this location and say that there's a certain measurement or quality or quantity of interactions that needs to be had. But remember, you're here as the balance of physical and light. And so in order to truly thrive and make that valuable connection, both as a human being as well as an earthly being, is to use them in proper balance. And so historically, if we look at locations within India, for example, there has been a focus on meditation. And because of that, there's been a forging of connection between the physical beings that exist on the surface of the earth and the energy that they are able to draw and capitalize from the inner earth. This isn't something that's always relayed and discussed in many of these ancient meditative practices, yet it happens anyway. It's somewhat like an extension of your aura. When you are breathing and meditating and practicing, inevitably your aura will become larger. And because of that, there are many benefits. you will interact with more humans, and you will make a logical influence of some kind, beneficial or otherwise, on them. But the aura doesn't only go outward from the body in a side to side fashion. It goes upward and downward as well. And so we notice this sometimes, that the enlightened masters of the ancient historic periods in India had these incredible auric fields, and they were helping to blend energies, truly, between the human interactions on Earth and the interactions that were had with the beings in the inner Earth. And we think this is what's facilitated a lot of what you have seen. But also keep in mind that the temples and the gathering places for prayer and meditation, many of these were assisted in their construction by intergalactic ships. And Syrians had a great hand in this, meaning they had been also called to locations like Atlantis very early on to help construct some of the pyramids. This was done using what we call light templates. In other words, a template was put together etherically and written into the energy field of the plasma ship. And then the minerals and the crystal and the rock of a land formation became alchemized by light moving through the template, forming a structure in perfect symmetry where all of the rest would fall away. And this is why beneath those structures you could see chambers that were made of the resulting transformation, the alchemy, very potent healing chambers that contained underground waterways, for example, and arrangements of crystal, very adorned even in sacred geometry. And so much of this happened also in India, as well as in many other locations. But we think that you're seeing the reverence and the appreciation to those beings and ships assisting in those endeavors as well.
You're referring to ancient enlightened masters who lived in that time, or in that ancient time. Now, in that Mount Kailash area, which is sort of the border between Tibet and China and India, there is history of an ancient Buddhist religion, or group of people called the Bon Buddhist Religion. And now the understanding is that linearly that religion started about 17,000 years ago. But as we've discussed before, prior to 9 to 12,000 years, there was a timeline shift. So how is it possible even to track that back to 17,000 years ago? First of all, can you tell me about the Bon religion?
Well, the Bon religion is a slight deviation from what is known as modern Buddhism today, but it evolved by speaking in tongues. So much of the chants that are known to have been practiced actually came from another dimension. And there is Syrian influence here, but it is not an exclusive Syrian influence. Much of these, we'll say elders that were involved in this practice, were actually taught to work with their plasma in order to levitate and to use the inner chamber, we'll say, of the heart and the various meridians to move energy through, such that they could not feel the difference in temperature between extreme heat and extreme cold, nor were they able to detect hunger, for example. It involved somewhat shutting down the physical system in order to default to using only light. Yet you're asking us about the number of years in which this practice was sustained on planet Earth. And we actually want to put it in a different dimension, meaning, of course, that it's difficult to calculate the exact time because on planet Earth, at the period in which there was a cataclysm, there were many souls that were both taken on ships, for example, and prepared to come back in an altered form, and others that took on roles and lifetimes in alternate dimensions just to become something other than who they were in preparation for what they called at the time the new earth. So ultimately, we can't put a determination on this in terms of where you stand today, because it's not only still going on, but it also reflects a period in which human souls were in a different dimension.
Was there any? So you said they're not Syrian entirely. Is there any connection to the Atlantean race? Obviously, well, as you're saying, it was in a different timeline. But did they coexist with the timeline of Atlantis then? Because linearly, they would have been in the same time frame.
We see some of them being Atlantean elders, but we say not exclusively, because what we notice about those that were studying this is that they were calling in other collectives and cosmic families to support, simply to blend techniques, meaning there was an invitation that went out for other enlightened beings from races beyond the earth to come in and join as a member of this sect, we'll call it, which we could even call a council, to teach in certain techniques that others did not have access to. So we agree, certainly, there is an Atlantean-Syrian connection, but we are simply explaining that it's not exclusive to that race.
The Bon religion is said to have certain practices and meditations and so on, some of which haven't even been made available to human beings in modern times. Now, maybe in exclusive circles they have been, but not in any mass way. Can you describe some of these meditations? What was the significance of them?
What the meditation was aiming for was no breath at all. We know this sounds impossible to achieve as a human being, and imagining that the breath is the foundation of meditation, it would seem impossible to do it unless you were breathing. But these beings were practicing in not using a physical body mechanism in order to transfer all of its energy into a sentient state, almost as if a soul was transferring itself from its material existence fully into light. But the techniques varied greatly, and they took many different phases, as you can imagine. First, fasting was the most important part of this practice, meaning in these days, even though food wasn't looked at in the same way that humans perceive it today, ingestion of anything had to be exclusively eliminated, because if the physical body was assimilating physical energy, it would begin to rely on that as opposed to the energy that it had within it. But also, sound was used as a foundation to reach what we'll call a state of samadhi, or a merged state in which the energy field was brought to its highest and most resonant place. Now, languages of light are very different today in terms of their cosmic orientation. We're speaking more of a tone and a blending of energies coming straight from the sacral and the root, where it was more of a low range guttural type of vibration, causing a reverberation throughout the entire system. It isn't necessarily related to the Om that many of you practice today, yet it would be the closest example we might find in relationship to this chant or divination practice. Stillness had to be found, meaning there could be no movement of the body, no fluctuation of the eyes, no focus on the hands or the feet, only a sense of being present and still without any use of the body. What eventually began to happen was that a soul would find itself moving between dimensions. And in that state, attempt to let go of the breath such that it carried it naturally and organically. There was a period where those who were in meditation, who were sitting in mudra, would actually begin to lie down because their body could no longer support the weight of their density, and it was necessary for them to be at complete and total rest. And you would begin to see the chamber of the heart, for example, and even the abdomen begin to slow in its breath, almost to nothing, where the breath became so shallow that a soul began to shift into an altered state of consciousness, whereby it was traveling beyond the veil. In that state, the goal was to stay as conscious to the physical plane as possible. So this was a dualistic type of experience where a soul may actually have a remote viewing experience of itself in the practice, as well as the group that it was with. But in addition to this, we began to notice the levitation of the body. It was a natural conclusion to the body fully letting go of its physical presence, and a soul accessing all of its light.
Now, interestingly, Jesus' tomb is actually very near Mount Kailash, and he supposedly spent his later years, although the biblical text suggests that he died on the cross. There's a lot of evidence suggesting that he visited a lot of Buddhist temples and lived in that area to a much older age and had children and so on. Is there any significance? Was he studying any of these ancient religions, such as the Bon, in his lifetime?
Well, keep in mind, Jesus as a master would have been on the earth before in many of these different time periods and locations, which was the primary reason for his visitation of any of them. Because as a master, what you are attempting to do is gather as many aspects of your soul from beyond the veil as possible, and to awaken them within yourself in order to apply them in some meaningful way in the timeline that your soul has chosen. But to have ended up at this point in his life connected to this location would have been no mistake, because we certainly see him as having been an elder in Atlantis, having come back and visited these many different locations. Ganesh, for example, and the many light teachers that initiated with him were there. But in addition to this, the energy present in that location in and of itself was a sustaining type of energy for him. Remember, the earth was holding coherence between the inner and the surface locations. And masters of this caliber, in approaching the end of their life, would have been preparing in some way of ceremony to gift the earth with all aspects of their energy. And so we see this as being somewhat of a final initiation or preparatory phase for leaving behind his legacy and the template of his energy that would be imbued within the earth.
So if we were to go to this tomb, now, so did Jesus walk the, I know in our linear timeline, the belief is that Jesus lived some 2,000 years ago. But there are some more ancient stories of beings like Jesus who lived very similar lives that predate the life of Jesus and predate the Bible. So did Jesus actually live 2,000 years ago in our linear timeline, or did he exist in another dimension? Obviously, his tomb is there, so is there something there remains of his, or is it just a belief that he was there?
Well, it is both. Jesus is a master who did walk the earth in a physical form, but the most enlightened masters will come to earth at a period of time where they are meant to make an important impact and have seeded before them in many lives that they have lived the knowledge and the gifts and the understanding of what they are to do here. In other words, many refer to mystery schools, and at this time, those in the Christ Collective having attended those schools. But the teachers themselves were actually aspects of these masters coming in a different form, leading them down the path of knowing themselves and understanding what they were yet to do. So many of these masters paved their own way, in other words, to be on the planet at the times that they were. But you're referring to the tomb of Jesus, and we want to make some clarification here because while we see this as a dedication to his life and perhaps assumed to be a burial location of his body, again, a master of this caliber would have prepared himself in order to be spread throughout the earth in very strategic locations. He is not the only one who has ever done this. There have been many other masters on the earth who have gone through this ritualistic practice and process where they prepared the body energetically, very much like the Buddhist collective that you have discussed, where the breath could be slowed almost to nothing. And the soul could have an experience of itself while it still existed on planet Earth. And in doing so, may have given others and even itself instructions as to how its body was to be treated like an earthly elixir, where it may have been perhaps burned in a ceremonial process where the various attendees had been called from different directions of the earth to take ashes with them to bless certain spiritual locations that would hold the earth in the energy of that master, that would allow others to experience that master through the same pilgrimage that he walked, in other words. So what you're asking us to confirm is the temple or the burial location of Jesus the actual place where his body exists. And we don't necessarily agree with that. We think a master of this caliber would have prepared his body and did so in such a way that it could be shared with the whole of the earth and not just exist in one location. That aside, we make note of the very powerful presence of Jesus that still exists in that space. Sometimes a temple or a place of reverence is created such that the soul has a place to reside where others who could see him in a familiar light may meet him directly. And we do believe this goes on there. So it's not to say that the presence of Jesus isn't there. And the soul or the master that was this man could not be called upon in this place. Yet we think the extension of all of him, his body, his light, his knowledge, his genetics, all that he did and all that he was too precious to remain in any one place.
You mentioned mystery schools, and nowadays, and for at least in the current timeline from post-Atlantean times, there have been a lot of mystery schools to this day. And nowadays, a lot of secret societies in the world and even in the United States, a lot of our world leaders belong to secret societies where it seems like they practice occult practices and rituals that we've discussed in previous conversations. These, what is the reason for there being these secret societies and mystery schools where these practices are taught in a secretive way? And are these, is that a phenomena that occurred post the Atlantean, the end of Atlantis, with teachings that actually were just part of everyday life in Atlantean times?
We do agree that much of this happened post Atlantis, and this is why. There was a fear amongst many that these highly powerful and energetic teachings would get into the hands of those who did not have the consciousness or intention to properly use them. To use them, in other words, for good. But the reverse is also true. We see there are many underground mystery schools and gatherings of souls that were aimed at hiding these teachings in order to hold and gain power. So it's actually across the board. When we are secluding something from the rest of the world, we do the world no justice, even if sometimes the intention is good. Because ultimately, what we want for the whole of humanity is for them to feel the trust and faith that they're able to use anything that we give them in the right way in order to serve and to love and to cherish their fellow mankind. But unfortunately, fear has gotten in the way, and that fear goes in both directions. Sometimes it is to hold back on something that others assume that humans are not ready for. And in many respects, it's to actually diminish the power and the value of humans in receiving the same amount of knowledge.
Are there any teachings that you feel that humanity is currently ready for that were taught in mystery schools in ancient times or even modern times that could be shared in a conversation like this?
It's hard for us to name them exclusively because we see so many that are already preparing to come to the surface and have expressed themselves, but not to the fullest degree. Meaning that when your consciousness begins to tip a certain scale, ancient teachings and prophecies and all of the things that the ascended masters have brought to the earth, they will begin to come back. And they come back first through individuals, those who are having their own awakenings, channeling spirit, for example, or remembering that they were actually a part of a council that contributed to the teaching as it stands. And we'll give you an example because we think while many of these are starting to bubble up and have some very good qualities, there's also some unfortunate interference with them that is still going on. Our most relevant example is the practice of Kundalini. This, across the board, we would say, was something that almost every enlightened civilization and ascended master on planet Earth has studied. Even if it was slightly different in its teaching, raising and activating the Kundalini was a foundation of spiritual enlightenment. Now, many on the planet today are attempting to achieve this state, and some are even teaching it. But unfortunately, we think those that are teaching it have sometimes been taking the teachings out of context. And again, we want to affirm that there are many different ways to teach these techniques. It may have been done differently in Lemuria than it was in Egypt, than it was in Atlantis. And that's the beauty of these ancient practices, is that there could be no one appropriate way to do them for any one collective because your structures are dynamically different than these ancient periods. So adjustments need to be made. The biggest problem we see, however, is that ego is getting in the way. Sometimes financial abundance is putting a contradiction in the teaching and creating some distortion. Or a teacher becomes highly recognized and begins to use the practice simply for their own benefit. And that's why you're not seeing such, we'll say, concrete expansion of the many things that you believe were taught in these mystery schools or hidden from humanity. Ultimately, what your consciousness is matching is the suppression of them. Even though they're coming to the surface, which is a good sign, showing us obviously that humans are ready and vibrationally attuned, there's still too much density, we believe, in the way. And we think that the way to get around this is to always feel within yourself when you are working with a teacher or a process, whether or not it is pure. Because everyone is meant to have an individualized experience of their Kundalini awakening. And one of the problems we see today is there's so much comparison and especially competition between humans as to what that means and how it should be done. But if you can take ownership of your own energy field and especially attune yourself in trust to your own intuition, you will know without a doubt whether you're intersecting with something that's truly ancient and has its foothold and roots in enlightenment, or something that has been swayed from it. So discernment is necessary, we believe, in these days where humans are awakening to so much, and there is a very fervent pace of new teachers and teachings coming to light, but still some confusion about the true purpose behind teaching them and offering them to others.
Is it possible to articulate the mechanics of that practice now, or is this something that humanity isn't quite ready for?
We could articulate the mechanics, certainly, but remember, the actual process might differ between individuals because ultimately, Kundalini awakening, while it's placed in the pineal gland, has very little to do with the pineal. There are electromagnetic sensitive connections between the pineal and all other chakras that illuminate when Kundalini rises, but the Kundalini essentially sits at the seat of the soul, where the root and the sacral come together, where that powerhouse of breath and energy meet. So raising the Kundalini actually has more to do with a tantric type of intimate and sexual connection that you are making within yourself, where you begin to access the material and physical components of very orgasmic light. And this isn't a manipulation necessarily. We have many ask us this oftentimes. Is this a sexual practice where there should be some type of physical manipulation in order to achieve it? And this was not the case at all in our day. In fact, doing this would diminish the energy because it's far more powerful than that. For us, it involved pulling the energy up from the perineum, bringing it up in such a way that it would expand into our sacral and we could tangibly make it rise. Not in a forceful way. We're not attempting perfection here, but we're getting into a state where the breath becomes the channel through which our energy rises. And as we pull the feeling of it up, we are eventually moving our body and our spirit and our mind into a state of coherence. To us, it's a state of quantum presence where we are no longer physical beings at all. As we're moving that sensation, we'll call it, that orgasmic elixir and sensation from the seat of the soul upward through the chakras, we eventually reach that electromagnetic center in the pineal, which illuminates a part of the brain. It begins to stimulate hormones. It's a godlike elixir that, as it rises through the crown, pours over us like manna from heaven. We begin to feel as if we are coated, actually, in a golden light. Now, many who have Kundalini awakenings do so in a very rigid and we would say even painful way. And it's because they have forced the energy too quickly, or they've had a spontaneous, we'll call it Kundalini awakening, that perhaps their their soul was ready for, but the body that existed in a different dimension couldn't handle. And we know these can be very difficult to assimilate. And this is why in our civilization, we were never taught to force or to raise it through a very active breath. What we notice people doing today is doing a very rapid Kundalini breath called the breath of fire. And while this breath has a purpose and is very supportive in the body's alchemy, it isn't the type of breath we are going for when we want to raise Kundalini. We want to do it slow. We want to channel it in such a way that we feel as if it is a part of us. It's a natural part of us rising with the breath. And then we get to the point where it can become one with us in any moment. And this is what many of us achieved. So the mechanics of it, they really exist within the chakra system, within the sexual organs, and within the brain. And using them together through a meditative practice, we are able to raise the Kundalini.
Now, you mentioned the perineum, so would we be pulling up on the perineum as we're raising Kundalini and then releasing as we're releasing?
That is correct. And again, we want to caution people here because everyone's body is a bit different, especially in this timeline. So to your comfort level, raising that up even slightly, we think, and doing so in combination with the breath, it is what sets the chain of events in motion.
You mentioned earlier at the Bon, we're teaching a meditation practice that didn't involve breathing. So in relation to the Kundalini we're talking about now, you mentioned that the breath of fire was not necessary, but so what kind of breath is used? Is it just your normal natural breathing, but maybe in conjunction with that you're pulling up on the perineum as you inhale and then exhale and release?
Correct. And in the practice that you are asking us about, the Buddhist technique, and across the board even, we would say this was a part of many ancient civilizations. There was a pause between the inhale and exhale. And the pause was perhaps one of the most important aspects of the practice, because in the pause, we were allowing the body to do the work without the influence of mind. If we were building on that pause, what we would find was eventually our breath would take over and we would not have to work at it at all. We would begin to find this balance between the as above, so below, the divine masculine and the divine feminine, the in-breath, the out-breath. Now, in the Buddhist practice, the pause in the breath was the focus. We were aiming to pause the breath as long as possible. And in doing so, the breath did not have to exist at all. What you may find in a more traditional Kundalini practice, if you are implementing a pause between the inhale and exhale, is that you will not have to think about the breath anymore. You will fall into a rhythmic practice where it takes a life of its own. And this is ultimately what you are going for. Many believe that they have to follow a certain practice, and in their mind, they are focusing on the in-breath and out-breath religiously. And in doing so, breaking the connection between the as above and so below. So if we're trying to pull energy upward, certainly for a while, we might need to focus in those lower chakras, and we may need to focus on the breath. But once it starts to ascend, what we're going for is a state of non-resistance, a state where we are not attuned at all to the practice. We're allowing the practice to carry us, and it is so easy to let go and feel and assume the Kundalini as a natural part of who we are. It is not something that has to be otherworldly or something that we have to achieve outside of our day-to-day experience. We can become the breath of Kundalini, and that bliss and that energy can follow us into our day-to-day reality.
Are there any other mechanics that are necessary to observe, like position of the tongue or any other bodily structures?
Certainly, these positions were used, various mudras of the fingers, positions of the eyelid, of the eyes behind closed lids, and the pressure of the tongue on the roof of the mouth. And the theory behind these things was that these electromagnetic connections behind the pineal had certain, we'll say, gathering places that would support the Kundalini activation. We don't necessarily think these are necessary, but if you would choose to do them, you could. These practices, obviously, as we've mentioned, were taught completely differently in different civilizations.
And are any visualizations necessary while conducting it, or is this simply the mechanics necessary?
We believe visualization can actually get a bit in the way of the process itself. The best position for you in terms of visualizing is to have a soft focus downward into the body. Even perhaps letting go of any connection to the outer world, where you're focusing downward very softly behind closed lids into the center of your body. And we find, for those of us who have practiced diligently, that just doing that sets off that chain of events automatically. It's somewhat like an automatic button where before we even begin to breathe, we close our eyes and gently focus them downward, and we can already begin to feel the Kundalini energy rising.
So this was a technique that was used or practiced by the ancient Atlanteans, is that, or the Syrians? What's the origin of this
You're
practice?
referring to the Kundalini?
Correct.
This is a cosmic, historic practice, meaning it has begun in star systems beyond the Earth.
And so how do beings who are, well, you said star systems beyond the Earth, how do they practice it, considering all these different beings have different mechanical structures, right? Their physical bodies are different in different dimensions.
Well, this is why we say it is so different. For example, a being that exists in the 12th dimension as a light collective is in a state of samadhi and kundalini at all times, because that unification within yourself is the goal of the kundalini. But in a collective state, if you've reached the 12th dimension, you are always unified. So there's no effort placed on kundalini at all. But we could take you back, for example, to Pleiades at a time when many of those in that star system were more focused on their spiritual evolution in a way that humans are, and say that their energetic bodies focused or were structured very much like your own. So the focus inward on raising the Kundalini from the chakras, even though they may have been structured a bit physically and non-physically differently than you, was always the same. So chakras, they are galactic centers, which is why we could say this is the similarity of the process. We are raising the Kundalini from the root or the perineum and the sacral and moving it upward. And even those that have transitioned into a more hybrid form have a chakra system, even if that chakra system is a bit more advanced than humans. For example, we have often stated that the chakra system is meant to become a solid core of light, where each chakra that exists individually becomes fused and operative in a unified fashion. And many who experience this are in a constant state of Kundalini, because the passage of light and energy between that central channel or meridian is simply so strong. But we could take you into Arcturus, for example, and say at a time when Arcturians preferred to be more physically focused, they used movement as a part of this breath practice. Not necessarily a breath of fire, but more yogic technique than what we have added into the equation. And we know some of that exists on planet Earth, and it does tend to come from Arcturian history. And it helped them because they tend to be not necessarily more physically attuned, but physically attuned to moving energy, in other words. So there are slight deviations, and there has to be. But the commonality, the common thread and the key is the galactic chakra system.
And what would we notice from a practice like this? What were the benefits of it?
What Kundalini will support is a soul's creation into higher dimensions. Because ultimately, the Kundalini being an elixir is somewhat like a conscious attunement into the present moment. It heightens your awareness. It helps not only the physical organs and systems to work better, but it blends those physical organs and systems with a more non physical part of you. You may call it the biofield, for example. And this is where a soul begins to not only see very clearly the geometry that exists within its life, which sometimes you call synchronicity, but also it becomes less reliant on physical effort in order to manifest because you are using your energy field and your mind and your physical presence in concert with each other. It's somewhat automatic. So in today's reality, many are using programs like law of attraction, for example, to attempt to manifest things that they need. But someone who is raised Kundalini or is practicing Kundalini is more organically attuned to what their soul's divine plan has already brought forth. And in so doing, will exemplify that because there's coherence. And when we speak of coherence, you are existent in a source field that connects to all things. And those things that are meant for you will be prioritized at the time that you need them. But unfortunately, you've been so taken away from truly understanding how this source field works that you negate the very things that show up for you as for you. And in fact, many times they are rejected for one reason or another. Kundalini is not only supportive of the soul's ability to clearly see and choose the things that the source field is activating for them, but also restore and rejuvenate the physical body. So many of you are struggling in physical disease, and certainly there are a great many changes that need to be made on the physical plane. But Kundalini, being an alchemical elixir in ancient times, was used not only for immediate manifestation, but immaculate conception. Immaculate conception is not just the birth of a soul in a physical way. Immaculate conception is the ability to come forth through and of yourself as an expanded version of it. And in plain terms, what this means is you begin to raise your dimension. Everything in your life has to change and upgrade to the consciousness that you assume. And that comes automatically. It comes more easily. It's not that you won't face challenges, but those challenges in a Kundalini state or in a practice like this, they don't feel so hard anymore because you feel and see the support around you. You feel less alone, even if you are not surrounded by physical souls that you feel you need, because ultimately we are all connected in unity consciousness.
How is this different from the 369 that we discussed in earlier conversations? And can you combine the two techniques for more benefits, such as maybe practicing Kundalini in front of a flower of life symbol?
Well, perhaps what we would say is the Kundalini is facilitating or supporting the true physical realization of the 369 that you always exist within. Because in so doing, it's bringing your own geometry back into symmetry. And that's where the healthy body extends from. It's where the clear mind extends from. It's where consciousness expands from. Now, certainly in many different applications, this image you speak of was utilized to focus on. As long as the focus or the visualization isn't done in such a way that there is some bias or predetermination of what it is meant to bring in. This is where we think you will put a contradiction in the way of what the Kundalini can provide for you in the way of a 369 connection, which is, remember, an unbroken channel of energy to the greater universe. So if you are using it, do so in non-expectation, in non-judgment, and certainly visualize it as if the breath is bringing you closer to it or you are becoming one with it. This is not required. Many of the renderings of the flower of life, for example, were first created by those who entered a state of samadhi or a state of kundalini, where they had the elixir we speak of, which may even be termed today DMT, which is a natural occurring substance in the body, and began to see it expanding outward from their own field. So this rendering, it reminds us of what we are already imbued within, making it a stronger connection to our mind, body, and spirit.
Thank you. And thank you, Micheila.
All right, thank you.
And thank you all for joining us again for another Channel Revelations. We'll be back next week with another Awaken Empowered podcast. And if you would like to listen to us instead of watching YouTube videos, you can also find us on various podcast platforms like Google or Apple Podcasts or Spotify and many others. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.